Strictly speaking, Death Wish 3 shouldn't be included in a series about video games based on flop movies. It did, after all, make $16.1 million off of a $9 million budget. A modest return perhaps from a modest budget, but not really a flop. However, Death Wish 3 is a terrible movie. It's from the Flop Factory canon, and it's got some fairly shocking behind-the-scenes stories. Plus, I really wanted to talk about the game Death Wish 3, god darn it, and I'm not going to let the fact that I've painted myself into a corner with the series title put pay to that. So, look, I'm not going to apologise, so just watch it, alright? Death Wish 3 is the third movie in the 5-movie plus 2018 remake franchise, following vengeful vigilante Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, who looks a lot like a moustache drawn on a pebble. Can you guess what the two movies before were called? Can you? Aren't you clever? Death Wish 1 and 2, well done. Having dealt with gangs responsible for violent crimes against his immediate family members, Paul decides to visit an old war friend because, well, he hasn't got any immediate family members left after the last two movies. The old friend Charlie promptly gets attacked by local gangs and dies. Because, Christ, Paul Kersey's luck isn't the best when it comes to local gangs and violence, is it? The rather hapless local police force arrest Kersey for the crime, and when they find out that Kersey is rather effective when it comes to dealing with 1980s looking gangs, they do a legally dubious deal with Kersey, which involves him doing their dirty work for them against the gangs that have overrun the problematic areas of the city where Charlie lived. And there we have the premise of Death Wish 3, both the movie and the video game. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the movie before we get to the game itself. Production company Canon had trouble getting Bronson to return, eventually persuading him by giving him a huge $1.5 million paycheck to reprise the role, which was a sixth of the movie's total budget. Bronson, you see, was extremely critical of the movie's script, but you know, lots and lots of money is a good way to overcome any concerns that us humans have. Put it this way, if I put my finger up your bum for £600, for instance, I wouldn't care if you washed your bum first. One issue that Bronson had was that while the violence was somewhat justifiable in previous movies, it was gratuitous to the extreme in this. In an interview he had with the Chicago Tribune, Bronson said that there are men on motorbikes, an element that's threatening, throwing bottles and that sort of thing, and I have to machine gun them down. That to me is excessive violence and therefore unnecessary. He's not really wrong, is he? Death Wish 3 was directed by Michael Winner in his third and final movie in the franchise. The Death Wish franchise was undoubtedly his biggest success, and most of his other work flopped critically and commercially. Winner had some controversy behind the scenes as well. His then lover, a jobbing actress called Sandy Grizzle, features in a scene where the gang attempts to rape a woman. Shortly before the movie's release, Sandy Grizzle sold her story to British tabloids, telling the papers how Michael Winner had used her as a sex slave and had whipped her around his bedroom. That's the sort of stuff that only Hollywood moguls can get away with, kids. Don't treat people as sex slaves. The film production struggled with its budget and was eventually moved from its setting in New York to being filmed in the much cheaper London. Actors and actresses hired when relocated ended up being British and so had to be overdubbed by not actors but US military personnel stationed at High Wycombe Air Station. This obviously leads to some terribly delivered lines. These people are military people, they're not actors. Their delivery could be compared to how I do a video, for instance. Fans of late 80s and 90s properties will want to keep an eye out for Bill from Bill and Ted and Councillor Troy from Star Trek The Next Generation in early roles that I would imagine probably don't feature very highly in their CVs. Death Wish 3 currently reports a dismal 6% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is an absolutely miserable average score indeed. And so, with that in the bag, we know it is a terrible movie. Let's move on to the video game. Death Wish 3, the video game, was published by Gremlin Graphics in 1987, some 2 years after the movie, but the same year that the VHS was released, on the MSX, the Amstrad CPC, the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. Made by the in-house team of Sean Hollingworth, Peter Harrop, Chris Kerry and legendary 8-bit maestro Ben Dalglish, Death Wish 3 is an ambitious action-adventure title indeed. You are cast as Bronson's Paul Kersey as he battles his way through the dilapidated neighbourhoods riddled with crime. Rather than being a straight-up left-to-right shooter with different stages, Death Wish 3 is a free-roaming adventure with explorable interiors, innocent bystanders, a different game that can be accessed by approaching the nearest window, gratuitous hyperviolence, and a police force that will either assist you or attack you depending on how you interact with them. Like I said earlier, Death Wish 3 was very ambitious. These are concepts not of an 8-bit computer game, but perhaps a couple of game console generations later. This is the sort of thing I would expect to see on a PlayStation 1 or 2 game. Does it deliver on the ambition? Not entirely, but it makes a reasonable attempt and works with what it has, which is a set of computers with the processing power today of a wristwatch you buy off Wish.com or a £25 microwave. The initial encounter you will have with Death Wish 3 will be utterly baffling. The concept of a 3D world in an 8-bit computer using 2D sprites is done by you, the gamer, rotating the environment using the up and down keys. It's completely bizarre to get to grips with and utterly unintuitive. Once you do get used to using the map and the compass at the bottom of the screen, you'll be less like the little 4-year-old who's lost his mum in the aisles of Sainsbury's and more like the grizzled 44-year-old retail assistant veteran who moans in front of customers about Sandra's preferential treatment when it comes to getting Saturdays off. Your main task is to enter buildings and find the heavily guarded gang bosses. You put a bullet in their head and subsequently you'll weaken the gang influence in that area of the city. You will get regular updates via this dot matrix printout of riots to tackle in different areas. The riots usually mean that in one of the buildings nearby, one of those gang bosses will reside. And then you can put a bullet in the head of these rather relaxed rebels. While you're in there, you can have a look out the window and snipe people in the street, just like my mum used to do, who's now in prison for life. I miss my mum. The buildings are also good places to top up your munitions, which range from machine guns to shotguns, from pistols to a god-darn bazooka. The game does not hang about when it comes to the bazooka. It sets it as your default starting weapon. One slap of the fire button and whatever is in front of you, be it a truncheon-wielding thug, a policeman or even a handbag waving innocent granny, is reduced to a rough rib cage filled with red paste. Make no mistake about it, Death Wish 3 is definitely a title designed for the movie's target audience of 18+ers, given its unusually hyper-violent nature for a game of the time. It's not just the violence though that puts the game ahead of its time either. As previously stated, the environment is fully explorable and the police react to your actions, but it's also the little details too. Ambulance workers, for some reason clad in surgeons' long coats, come along and drag bodies away, even if it means scraping up the visceral scar left by a bazooka shell. The grannies will also bonk anything that they don't like on the head, and the street workers will flash a single buttock at passers-by in order to attract men to stick their fingers up a bum for less than my charge of £600. Do you remember that from earlier? Reviews? Well, they were surprisingly mixed for what I think is a terrific little title. CMVG and Your Sinclair both praised the title to high heaven. CMVG called it technically excellent with brilliant graphics, declaring it an excellent game that is shockingly realistic. I'm not sure I agree with it being realistic, but then I've never been to New York, so I have no idea if people get regularly blown up by bazooka shells, or if the entire population of New York is made up of policemen, prostitutes and grannies. Your Sinclair said that for once the word tie-in isn't the kiss of death. This is a shoot 'em up with a difference and is packed with clever touches. Sinclair user called it outrageously violent with occasional touches of humour. They weren't quite as into it as everyone else, saying that there's not enough gameplay variety to hold interest though, and gave it a 7 out of 10. Crash magazine though, what are you smoking guys? They gave it a lowly 45% and said the attractive appearance doesn't compensate for the unexciting gameplay. I disagree, sir. And neither does Bazza H. I'll leave a link to his comparison between the three titles. He goes into far more detail about the game, and he absolutely loves Death Wish 3 on the Spectrum, so it's worth having a look at his video on that. So in spite of what Crash said, if you've ever wanted to play a really good video game based on a really terrible movie, you'll struggle to find a bigger disparity between a movie and its adaptation than Death Wish 3. Please, by all means, give it a go. Okay, thanks, bye.